her vision was of a strong Britain. It was of a prosperous Britain. It was of a Britain that was premised upon economic growth. But that's not what the rest of her party was interested in at the time. There was a term, disparaging one, managed decline, and she found this appalling. But odd as it might sound to us, a lot of people were fine with that. You manage decline, you live okay. Unfortunately, it didn't work. And so I think by 1979, it's not that the British public said, we love Margaret Thatcher, we love all of her ideas, we're all Hayekians now. What happened was that the alternative had become intolerable.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It's a great pleasure to welcome Charlie Cooke of the National Review Online. I've enjoyed Charlie's remarks with his colleagues for quite some time, and it is wit I recommend to everyone. The news these days can be grim and momentarily can be frightening given the tariff disputes. However, there is wit there to find, and years later you reflect, what was I worried about? Charlie, a very good evening to you. Thank you for this. You've written recently for the new Civitas Institute, Civitas Outlook, your memories of being a child in Britain before and after Margaret Thatcher. You reach back to your parents' experience before Margaret Thatcher and your experience after Margaret Thatcher. The payoff here is that it was a bright, shining world thanks to Margaret Thatcher, but let's begin at the beginning. There was a moment that Britain, recovering from the Great War in 1945, veered into what we now regard as cradle-to-grave socialism. What did that mean for your parents, who I believe met and married in the 1970s? What was the world to them, almost 30 years after the war? Good evening to you, Charlie.
Good evening. Well, it's really a remarkable roller coaster of a story. My mother's father was born in 1918, and at that point, the British Empire was larger than it had ever been or would ever be. The zenith of the British Empire was between about 1918 and 1923. And if you fast forward 50 years from then, you start to see a decline in the late 1960s into the 1970s, in which Britain becomes known as the sick man of Europe. And what that looks like is not just economic dysfunction, which I think marked out much of the Western world. The United States economy was poor in the 1970s as well, but political dysfunction where the unions are effectively running the government. You have union officials who will say quite publicly that they will bring down the government if the government doesn't give them what they want. You have inefficiencies in industry. You have a total lack of confidence in Britain that went from having an empire to not really knowing what its role on the world stage was to be, certainly post-Suez. And you have a lack of prospects for young people, which led to a brain drain. And if you go back a few years before my parents met in 1976, 10 years, in fact, there's the famous song on Revolver by the Beatles, Taxman. 1 for you, 19 for me, George Harrison sings. That was the tax rate the Beatles were paying. 1 for you, 19 for me. And that is not the sort of economic environment that people who are ambitious or talented want to stay in. And so a huge number of people left Britain and they moved around the world to Australia, Canada, the United States, France, Germany, and so forth. And the point I was trying to make was that prior to Mrs. Thatcher's election in 1979, Britain really was in a very bad way, of the sort that as a child who grew up in the 1990s, I could never have imagined. My parents had rolling blackouts. The trash was piling up in the streets. Huge numbers of really important industries were run by the government. The railways, the telephone companies were the ones that they saw firsthand, but most of the industries had been nationalized in the 1940s and 50s. And it was just not a good place to be. Meanwhile, you have inflation is through the roof. To fight it, you have high interest rates. It was in trouble.
I tell my story of arriving at Edinburgh in 1973 for the New College Seminary, an American graduate student looking for adventure in the world. And Scotland is charming and romantic, but there was a day that I went down to the new town, Princess Street, which is where the commercial center of the country, of the city is, and of Scotland. And was struck by a work crew on the road fixing, I think, a pothole or a bump in the road. And there was one man working, and five or six is my memory, standing around watching him.
Yeah.
And I puzzled what I was seeing. And I think this is a municipal version of the union domination of the environment. This was during Harold Wilson's,
Right.
well, there was an election in 74. I witnessed the election that transferred the conservative Mr. Heath's power into the labor Mr. Wilson's power. But the reason I mentioned that is because it didn't matter. Both parties
Right.
were guilty of the same. What was it? What was the spirit at the time that they could allow it to drift to that?
Well, I think after the Second World War, a couple of things happened. The first was that the British Empire came to a close and Britain was bankrupt after World War II. And so Britain handed over its former role to the United States. Suddenly, the United States was the preeminent naval power. And that, coupled with what was a totally reasonable process of decolonization, left Britain unsure as to what it was for. That, in turn, coincided with, and I think this happened everywhere in the world, a movement toward post-World War II utopian thinking, some of which was understandable, and a belief in expertise. Now, in America, that belief in expertise was most famously felt in foreign policy, where you have Robert McNamara in charge of Vietnam. And when that collapses, you get the Reagan Revolution of the 1970s. But I think Vietnam was probably the the crux of it, because in other areas, that belief in expertise in the United States did actually bear fruit. For example, with the moon landing of 1969, that was a good example of experts getting it right. In Britain, the belief in expertise infected every part of the government, and central planning became the norm. And the results were absolutely awful, but there was no counterbalance. Britain did not become the world's largest economy, the world's largest superpower, unlike the United States. Britain did not land on the moon. So, as well as this decline in economic fortunes, you had this cultural malaise. And by the late 1970s, both parties had been operating on that assumption for years, maybe 2 decades. And it took someone like Margaret Thatcher to come along. And at first, her ideas were unpopular and say, this is not how we do it. We need to get back to something else. And that's the next part of the story.
I saw before Margaret Thatcher and I saw after Margaret Thatcher, and it didn't occur to me that I was seeing something remarkable until I read Charlie's essay about his parents before and after Margaret Thatcher. What do we need to know about her background? They often mocked her as the daughter of a tradesman. Did that
Yeah.
did that mean she wasn't worthy to lead?
Well, I think among some people, that was the view. You have here a woman, for a start, in an all boys club, and a woman who, unlike most of the people in that boys club, had not gone to private school and did not come from a political background. Her father was a grocer. Now, it should give you some indication of how intelligent and capable Margaret Thatcher was, that despite coming from a lower upper middle class background, let's say, with a father who was a grocer, she went to Oxford and then she became a chemist. She didn't study history or politics. She studied chemistry. She was involved with the team that created soft serve ice cream. That was her first foray into the world. And over time, she drifted toward politics. Now, she was fortunate in that she married a rich businessman, Dennis Thatcher, who gave her the freedom to run for political office. But her worldview was formed watching her father run his little store. She thought that the lessons that households learn, that you can't spend money that you don't have, that economizing is necessary, that entrepreneurial spirit and hard work yields good outcomes, were able and really necessary to be extrapolated out to the nation at large. Now, one of the criticisms you hear of Margaret Thatcher sometimes is that she occasionally mistook home economics for macroeconomics. I think there's a little bit to that, but basically she was right. Basically, what Thatcher was arguing was that just as the housewife, and that's the word she would have used, the housewife has to look through the budget and make sure that it adds up, so should the government. You can't borrow money you don't have. She used to say pennies don't come from heaven, they have to be earned here on earth. So her background was very important because she thought correctly, I think, that she had a solid understanding of how normal, hardworking people lived and that government had forgotten that.
Not only forgotten it, but she was actively opposed by seriously powerful members of the British government. If
Right.
I'm reading now, I wasn't there, but I read about it afterwards. And they opposed her because I'm not quite sure where they got the idea. Europe was coming together at this point. These were the early days of what becomes the European Union. She was opposed because she was a Tory, a conservative. Is that why? I mean, what she was saying was, we've got to pay for ourselves. We can't just
Yeah.
forever. But why was that? Unions I understand, but I don't understand the the lords and ladies of the land opposing it.
Well, not just the lords and ladies, but that soft middle class British Toryism that is at odds with Margaret Thatcher's more classically liberal or Victorian approach to economics. She loved William Gladstone. She wasn't what's called a one nation Tory. And that was out of fashion at the time. It's not a perfect analogy, but one way of looking at it in America might be to note the battle eventually won by Ronald Reagan between the Goldwater faction in the Republican Party and the Rockefeller faction within the Republican Party. Now, it's slightly different in Britain because you have a lot more entrenched class habits than we have here in the United States. But her dynamic, brusque way of looking at the world, her, and I understand why people found this difficult when they were going through it, but her willingness, for example, in the early 1980s to withstand a recession, to engage in what Schumpeter would have called creative destruction, to reorganize the economy on a sounder footing, was not appealing to people who just wanted a quiet life. And I think her vision was of a strong Britain. It was of a prosperous Britain. It was of a Britain that was premised upon economic growth and dynamism and that would attract foreign investment. But that's not what the rest of her party was interested in at the time. There was a term, disparaging one, managed decline, and she found this appalling. But odd as it might sound to us, a lot of people were fine with that. You manage decline, you live okay. And, unfortunately, it didn't work. And so I think by 1979, it's not that the British public said, we love Margaret Thatcher, we love all of her ideas, we're all Hayekians now. What happened was that the alternative had become intolerable. Rather than creating an acceptable managed decline from empire, what you had was total dysfunction and poverty and a lack of opportunity. And eventually people just kicked out the incumbent Labour government. It wasn't that they embraced Margaret Thatcher at first. It was that they said anything must be better than the alternative.
Prime Minister 1979 to 1990, which is surprisingly coterminous with the presidency of Ronald Reagan. And Charlie,
Right.
that this is a couple who work together. They work together to reinforce the same understanding of pay for yourselves. But there was one other aspect that all of a sudden, Charlie, comes back to us. That is to confront nuclear weapons and those states that are dangerous with them. And at the time, it was the Soviet Union. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, once Reagan was in office, which begins in 81, and then soon afterwards he goes through the crisis of the near-death assassination. But once they worked together, they were is it the secret weapon or was it a public weapon of undoing the Soviet Union? How do you remember it, Charlie? Was it secret? Did everybody know they were doing it?
No, I think people knew they were doing it. And I think what they had in common was that they both had a moral conception of both their home countries and of the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan thought America was a good place. Margaret Thatcher thought Britain was a good place. They both considered them forces for good in the world. They didn't think it was just another country. They didn't think that everyone is the same. They thought that Britain and America were good. And by extension, they thought the Soviet Union was evil. Ronald Reagan said that explicitly in 1982. Margaret Thatcher agreed with him. She thought that this was a force for ill in the world that needed to be defeated. And I should say, it wasn't just communism. She also, in the early 1980s, fought the Falklands War. The Argentinians invaded an island that is full of British citizens, that has, I think, 97% approval of British citizenship. There's no great movement on the Falkland Islands to depart from the British citizenry. And it was invaded by the Argentinians who said, this is our island. There's a historical dispute over it. And she said, no, it's not. And she said, there's just no difference between Argentina having invaded the Falkland Islands, which is full of British citizens, and Argentina having invaded Britain. I am the prime minister of both. It's my obligation to defend them. So she had a view that weakness invites evil, and she was opposed to both, and she reoriented British foreign policy as a result, and I think sort of overcame, much as the first Gulf War in the United States got rid of some of the ghosts of Vietnam, the Falklands War in Britain got rid of some of the ghosts of Suez and made Britain look and feel strong again.
Brezhnev, the old apparatchik, dies in 82, replaced by the head of the KGB, Andropov, a wicked man who had one of his proteges named Gorbachev. Andropov dies. This is all during Margaret Thatcher's and Ronald Reagan's understanding that the Soviets were a threat to world peace. Andropov dies, replaced by an even older apparatchik, Chernenko, who dies, and a year later comes Gorbachev. Margaret Thatcher works directly on Gorbachev. I remember a picture of him arriving with his wife in London to be feted by Margaret Thatcher. How did she do that, Charlie? Is there a method we could use it again?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. I think the key to understanding her and with Reagan as well was that these people were statesmen, and being a statesman is very difficult. This is something that surprised me, because when I was a little boy, you just assumed that the people who were revered, Lincoln, Reagan, Thatcher, Churchill, that they are perfect, right? And that what they did was they just had this perfect talent and this worldview that was Manichaean, and that it just worked out. It's just not true. I mean, Reagan used to make concessions. Churchill made concessions, and Margaret Thatcher made concessions as well. And so, yeah, she was the Iron Lady in the sense that she didn't give up, but statecraft is complicated. It requires a lot of hard work and attention and give and take. And she was very good at that. Now, she was less good at that at home. She managed to stay prime minister for 11 years, but she could be really over the top with her own party. And this is depicted in the movie with Meryl Streep, came out a few years ago, where she made enemies she didn't need to. But on the world stage, she was good at the give and take of it. And so it's difficult to answer what exactly it was, except that she had the patience and the talent and the resolve to engage in that in a way I think a lot of modern politicians have stopped doing.
Remember that Ronald Reagan leaves office in January of 1989. The Soviet Union doesn't leave office for another 2 years. So Thatcher, working Gorbachev alone, had a vision she followed through on. Does she get credit for that today, Charlie? We have less than a minute. Is she venerated for having undone that threat?
Well, she certainly is by me and by conservatives. I do worry a little bit that as a culture, both in Britain and the United States, we have forgotten the scale of the threat that we faced and the achievement that Reagan and Thatcher and John Paul II and others made in fighting it without firing bullets. I mean, but yeah, I do think that in 100 years' time, when she's no longer seen as being intrinsic to our current domestic disputes, which she still just about is, I think it will be absolutely clear what she did.
Charlie Cooke of the National Review Online, writing at the Civitas Outlook for Civitas Institute, remembering Margaret Thatcher then and now. I'm John Batchelor.